Hey folks, my name is Jason Brian Santos, and I am the teaching elder and minister of Word and Sacrament at Community Presbyterian Church in Lake City, Colorado, a small mountain town of about 400 people in an 8,700-foot elevation, and actually in the most remote county in the lower 48 states. I have been here for about 2.5 years, and prior to this, I was at the national office. I worked at the Presbyterian Church, working in the Presbyterian Mission Agency, and there I oversaw the area of Christian formation, and this is what led me to be connected to, in part, to this curriculum. Today we're going to talk about the idea not of forgetting Sabbath as we did last time, but actually of remembering paradise. And I'm not going to go as far as saying remembering Sabbath, as you'll discover in this lesson that the concept of Sabbath is something that really wasn't introduced till the time where we find in the narrative of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness and complaining and grumbling and not having water, and Moses struck the rock and water came out, and then he lost his privileges of going into the promised land because of his anger. But then they were in the wilderness and they didn't have food, and they were complaining, and God responded to their grievance with manna, and then gave them the command not to collect that manna on the seventh day. And this concept he called Sabbath. And again, the idea of Sabbath means to cease. But that's not what happened in the Paradise Garden. And in fact, when we look at the whole creation narrative, you see God creating in 6 epic periods. Some like to think those are days, some like to think those are 1,000 years, and some like to think those are undetermined times. And really, it doesn't make a difference in the end. What we do agree on is that God created all from nothing, and God created in 6 days or 6 epics. And we want to look at that because at the end of the 6th epic, God created humanity. And God gave humanity their image, and that image for centuries and for millennia has been understood to be our rationality, our relationality, our reason, our creativity, our innovation, our relationship interactions, our self-reflection, and the way we create totally and innovate the way God did. And all of these things are aspects of the Imago Dei that we lost when the fall happened, and we also lost the likeness. We're creating God's image and likeness, and that likeness is often understood as God's righteousness or holiness, being set apart, and we were no longer set apart in the same way, and we were thrust into the world out of the garden, and God placed some curses on us, and one of the curses was on the ground and on Adam and Eve, and they would have to now work the ground. And so they went from a place where they would just select fruit from the tree. They were fruitarians, but they would just eat from the tree. God provided everything from the fruit and the vegetation there in the Garden of Eden. But when they left that garden, they were faced with the challenges of having to labor over their food. That means that they were going to have to collect those seeds, and they were going to have to, in the right time of the year, dig up the ground and turn it over and plant those seeds and water those seeds and weed those seeds. And even still, by the God's grace, the sun came down and plants grew. But then when the plants came to harvest, they would have to harvest those grains, and then they would have to take those grains, and then they would have to crush them, and then they would have to make them into powder, and then they would have to add oil and water, and then bake them. And the whole process involved with eating was basically human labor. And God said, you're not going to just get a freebie from the fruit of the tree right now. You're actually going to have to work for this. And so when you think about those sense of exchanging your earthly rhythms for holy rhythms, in essence, this is what we're talking about, that the new rhythm of Adam and Eve's lives as they were kicked out of the garden, and every human being that came after, was one of production. And we see the ultimate abuse of that in the 400 years plus of slavery that the Israelites found themselves in after the Joseph narrative, during the time of famine, all the Israelites came to Egypt, and Joseph offered them refuge and provisions, and the Pharaoh was like, oh, this is too many, they're getting too powerful, and so he oppressed them. And for 400 years, the existence of the Israelites was every day the same thing, working, labor. And what God did in the Exodus in that manna story was say, hey, you know what? I want you to be able to be freed from this endless labor that you're in. And when you remember paradise, you actually go back to that sixth day of creation where God made humanity and then instituted something entirely different, something so radical that we didn't understand. God made time holy. He took a day of this creation, or an epic of this creation, and said, I'm just going to dwell in it. And God made the seventh day holy. And in that seventh day, I like to have this image of God frolicking in the garden and playing in the garden and walking in the cool of the evening with Adam and Eve, where there was nothing separating the divine and the human relationship, that there was connection and intimacy, and we lost that. And part of what God was intending to do in giving the Israelites this Sabbath, this day, this holy day, is to help them remember the paradise that was lost. Those Jews, those Israelites would have been very familiar with the creation narrative, and being able to tap into that narrative and understand it differently and say, oh, that seventh day rest that God had has now been given to us. And it's not so that we can just kick back and relax, but that we can exchange those earthly things, those earthly curses, those earthly labors that we have been so bound by, in exchange for the holiness of dwelling in God's presence and remembering that paradise that was lost. So as you explore this lesson, just think back, what would it have been like to dwell in that garden? And how would a sense of that paradise exist in a world today? Because for many Jewish observers of Sabbath, the Sabbath is, in essence, a paradise that was lost in the garden, and that they are looking forward to tasting as their eternity in the future.